Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Picture this. It's the middle of winter in 19th century London.
Oh, brutal time to be there.
Right, just freezing. And a young medical student is walking through these cold cobblestone alleys. A little boy leads him over to this massive pile of discarded crates and barrels. The student offers him a single copper coin, and suddenly 73 homeless boys crawl out from under a single freezing tarpaulin.
Wow.
Yeah, they had just been huddling together to literally survive the night.
It's just a devastating image. And, it perfectly encapsulates the utter failure of the institutions of that era to handle the human fallout of the Industrial Revolution.
Totally. And we are pulling that image straight from our source material for today's deep dive, which is the 1911 book, The Intermission, a handbook for Christian workers by Reverend J.F. Ole.
Yeah, and we're looking at this text because it chronicles a massive movement that completely flipped the script on how society handles poverty, addiction, and, urban decay.
Right, so whether you're working in social services today, or you're studying history, or you're just wondering, how we ended up with the social safety nets we have right now in your own city, this deep dive is going to show you the roots of modern urban charity.
Absolutely. But to really grasp what the author is outlining here, we have to establish what the intermission actually means. Because, when we hear the word missionary, we usually picture someone boarding a ship and, traveling to a foreign land.
Yeah, going overseas somewhere.
Exactly. But the intermission was a radical pivot. It argued that the mission field was actually domestic. It was right within Christendom, within the borders of so-called Christian nations that were honestly just crumbling from the inside out.
And their core philosophy was, it was completely holistic. They believed you can't just hand a starving person a religious tract, pat them on the back, and walk away.
Right, that doesn't fix the hunger.
No, but equally, you can't just hand them a piece of bread, fix their physical hunger, and totally ignore their spiritual and psychological desolation. You need a dual approach.
A dual approach that we see officially ignite in September 1848.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So the setting is Germany. The country is reeling. You've got the lingering devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, and on top of that, rapid industrialization is just cramming thousands of desperate people into these congested, unsanitary cities.
It's extreme poverty and massive social unrest.
Exactly. And Johann Hinrich Wichern stands up at the Wittenberg Church Congress and delivers what the text basically describes as a trumpet call. He challenges the entire Protestant church to stop turning a blind eye and actually demonstrate its faith through active, saving love on the streets.
Hold on, though. I'm trying to square this with what we know about the 1800s. The church wasn't exactly ignoring the poor before 1848, right?
Yeah.
Every parish had poor boxes. They gave out alms.
Yeah, they did.
So why did Wichern treat this like some massive, unprecedented emergency that required a whole new movement?
What's fascinating here is that Wichern had spent 2 decades running a rescue home in Hamburg called the Rowie House. He had been in the trenches. He realized the old parish system was just completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of industrial poverty.
Oh, so it was a numbers game.
Partly, yes.
Right.
But more importantly, the author points out a fundamental philosophical split between the intermission and what the book refers to as sociology, or secular humanitarianism.
Right, okay, because the humanitarian approach was essentially, if we improve the environment, we improve the person.
Exactly. The assumption was, hey, if you just give people better houses and better wages, then moral and social decay will naturally evaporate. But the intermission fundamentally disagreed with that premise.
You didn't think that was enough?
No, they argued that the root of all external environmental decay is internal. In their theological framework, it's sin. So if you want a permanent change in society, you can't just treat the symptoms. You have to cure the underlying disease. You have to change the human heart.
It's like the difference between treating a fever with an ice pack versus actually prescribing antibiotics for the infection. Sociology was the ice pack. It gave temporary relief. The intermission wanted to be the antibiotic.
That's a great way to put it.
And what's crucial for you, the listener, to understand is that Wichern didn't just target the destitute. The intermission aimed that antibiotic at the rich, too.
Yes, that's such an important point.
Right. They saw the greed, the extravagance, and the complete spiritual apathy of the wealthy upper classes as part of the exact same moral disease that was affecting the slums.
The sickness of society spanned all tax brackets. Wichern was diagnosing a systemic failure, but, he wasn't inventing a brand new cure in 1848. he was actually looking backward to move forward. He wanted to resurrect the operational model of the early Christian church.
Like the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the text actually goes into fascinating detail about how those early Christians absolutely shocked the Roman world.
They really did. Because the Roman state had a welfare system, they handed out free corn.
Right, but it was purely a political calculation. They just wanted to keep the populace from rioting. It was cold, transactional, bureaucratic.
Exactly. The early Christians operated on an entirely different paradigm. They functioned as an extended family. I mean, we have historical accounts in the text of Christians pooling their own funds to buy slaves specifically to grant them freedom.
Oh, wow.
And they went out and rescued infants that Roman citizens had abandoned to die of exposure. They appointed deacons whose sole job was to personally visit and oversee the needs of the vulnerable.
It was intensely relational. You weren't a case number, You were a brother or a sister.
Yeah.
But over the centuries, especially moving into the Middle Ages, that pure relationship-based charity mutated into something totally unrecognizable.
It became heavily distorted. Charity shifted from an act of brotherly love into a spiritual transaction. It basically became a mechanism for the wealthy to purchase their way out of purgatory.
Wow.
The text actually quotes a historian describing it as a way to get a satisfactory balance on the books of the recording angel.
Okay, let's unpack the psychology of that for a second. If your only motivation for giving a coin to a beggar is to score cosmic points for your own afterlife, you don't actually care if the beggar's life improves.
No, not at all.
The beggar is just a prop for your own salvation.
And that psychological dynamic is exactly why it bred indolence and professional begging. The wealthy benefactor wanted the spiritual credit for the alms, but they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the messy, difficult work of walking alongside that person.
So no rehabilitation.
None. It was giving stripped of all human connection.
So Wichern's intermission was essentially a rebellion against both of these historical failures. He rejected the transactional buy-your-way-to-heaven charity of the Middle Ages, and he rejected the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of the modern state.
Right.
He wanted that intensely relational early church model back. But, you can't run a national movement on a philosophy alone. You need people. You need absolute pioneers who are willing to walk into the fire.
And the source text highlights some extraordinary individuals who embodied this. Take Amalie Sieveking, for instance. In 1801, a horrific cholera outbreak hit Hamburg.
And if you don't know much about 19th century cholera, it was terrifying. People would turn blue, suffer severe dehydration, and literally die within hours.
Yeah, when it hit Hamburg, mass panic set in. People just fled. But Amalie Sieveking didn't flee. She walked directly into the cholera hospital and basically ran the place alone when no one else would step up.
That is just incredible bravery.
It is. She was working in unimaginable conditions, surrounded by death, and her sheer, undeniable courage eventually shamed and inspired a whole society of women to join her in caring for the sick and poor.
She proved the power of individual agency in a crisis. We see that same disruptive agency with Thomas Barnardo, whom we mentioned at the start of the deep dive, the medical student who discovered those 73 freezing boys.
Right, and Barnardo actually used the shock of that discovery to force the hands of the elite. There's this incredible story in the book where he's at a fancy dinner party with the Earl of Shaftesbury.
Oh, I love this story.
The wealthy guests start questioning his claims about the scale of child homelessness. They just don't believe it. So Barnardo doesn't just sit there and argue with them. He orders cabs to the restaurant.
Yes. He forces this entire party of wealthy men in their evening wear out into the freezing slums of East London.
He pulls back the tarpaulins and makes them look at the reality of their own city. He's stripped away their ability to claim ignorance.
So powerful. But while individual heroics from people like Sieveking and Barnardo were crucial catalysts, Wichern knew that, adrenaline and willpower couldn't sustain a nationwide movement.
No, they needed permanent infrastructure. They needed trained, dedicated workers.
Which leads us to the revival of the ancient diaconate, specifically the deaconesses. To handle the overwhelming need, they developed the mother house system. The most famous one was championed by a man named Fliedner at Kaiserswerth.
Now, creating houses where women lived together in uniform, dedicating their lives to service in a deeply Protestant country like 19th century Germany, this immediately raised suspicions.
Oh, I bet. People thought they were just recreating Catholic nunneries. Aren't you just reversing the Reformation?
Exactly. But the author goes out of his way to clarify the psychological and contractual differences here. In the mother house system, there were no permanent binding vows in the Roman Catholic sense. A deaconess retained her evangelical liberty.
That liberty is huge.
It was fundamental. If her family fell ill and needed her, or if she simply decided she wanted to marry, she could leave the sisterhood honorably. There was no stigma. It wasn't a prison or a lifelong trap. It was a highly organized training center and career path.
Right. The Mother House gave these women rigorous medical and theological training. It provided them with a salary. And critically, it promised them a safe, comfortable home for their old age if they gave their working years to the mission.
And it was managed collaboratively, too. You had a pastor who acted as the house father and a sister superior who acted as the house mother. They balanced the administrative, spiritual, and medical operations together.
So, armed with this growing army of highly trained workers, the intermission turned its full attention to the most complex, dangerous environment of the era, the rapidly expanding industrial city.
Because the traditional parish church model, where people lived in the same village for generations and walked to the local chapel on Sunday, that was totally useless in the transient, chaotic slums of Berlin or London.
Yeah, the Berlin City Mission under Dr. Adolf Stucker is the perfect case study here. They realized that if the working masses weren't going to walk through the church doors, the church had to take the doors off the hinges and go to the masses.
It wasn't a quiet Sunday service. It was a massive, aggressive logistical operation. They had their own printing presses, churning out literature. They deployed street preachers into the darkest alleys.
They literally stationed trained choirs on bustling street corners, using music to cut through the noise of the city and force people to stop and listen.
They adapted their methods to the environment completely. But beyond the broad street preaching, what really makes the intermission's urban strategy so brilliant is their hyper-specialization.
Yes, this is fascinating.
They didn't just offer generic charity. They engineered bespoke solutions for highly specific urban traps.
Like the seamen's missions. Think about a major port city in the 1800s. The moment a sailor stepped off a ship with his wages, or, a young country girl arrived looking for work, they were instantly surrounded by predators.
The text actually calls them human sharks. Unscrupulous boarding house owners, employment scammers, brothel operators.
So the intermission built specialized hospices right at the docks. Their whole goal was to intercept these vulnerable people the second they arrived, providing a clean, safe, affordable environment to shield them from exploitation.
And they also built specialized care for those who had already been chewed up by the city. The Magdalen homes, designed for fallen women or prostitutes, are honestly a fascinating study in trauma care long before modern psychology even existed.
Pastor Heldring established the rules for these homes, and his approach was revolutionary. He demanded that these homes could never function as prisons. The doors were unlocked.
Yeah, the women had to be there voluntarily, and they could walk out whenever they chose.
And the spatial design of the homes was just as important, right?
Oh, absolutely. The standard institutional approach of the day was to warehouse hundreds of people in massive cold wards. Heldring recognized that if you put 100 deeply traumatized individuals in one room, you just create an unmanageable feedback loop of despair and bad influences.
So he decentralized it.
Mm-hmm.
The women lived in small family-style cottages of 10 or 12, supervised by a house mother.
Think about how that rewires the brain. It removes the institutional sterility and replaces it with a domestic, familial structure. It allowed for personalized monitoring of triggers and genuine relationship building.
And we see that exact same diagnostic nuance applied to their inebriate asylums. Society largely viewed the alcoholic as a criminal or just a moral failure to be thrown in a jail cell.
Right. But the intermission took a dual approach. They treated the alcoholic as both an invalid suffering from a physical disease and a sinner in need of spiritual regeneration.
That dual diagnosis is incredibly modern. And the groups that supported them, like the Blue Cross Society, operated on this principle of deep empathy. The author notes that they advocated for total abstinence from alcohol.
But, and this is key, it wasn't enforced as some harsh, legalistic rule to prove how righteous they were. The workers chose total abstinence out of love for the vulnerable.
They refused to ask an addict to undertake a discipline that they weren't willing to model
It
themselves.
was a profound solidarity of sacrifice. You are not above the people you are trying to help. You are walking beside them. But as vital as these hospices and asylums were for rescuing people who were drowning, the intermission recognized they also needed to stop people from falling into the river in the first place.
Which brings us to the structural masterpiece of this entire book. The Elberfeld system of poor relief. If you take nothing else away from this deep dive, listen to how they handled municipal welfare.
Initiated in the city of Elberfeld in 1852 by a banker named Daniel Wunderheit, this system completely reimagined how a city distributes aid.
Think about how government welfare often operates today. It can feel like an impersonal ATM. You fill out a stack of forms, you wait weeks, and a distant bureaucracy dispenses a maker check. It's totally disconnected from your actual day-to-day reality.
Yeah.
The Elberfeld system replaced the ATM with a dedicated family doctor.
Von der Heydt looked at the massive centralized welfare bureaucracy and just smashed it into pieces. He divided the city into tiny, hyper-local districts. He then assigned a volunteer helper called an Armenpfleger to oversee each district.
But the genius of the system, the mechanism that actually made it work, was a strict cap on the workload. A helper was never allowed to have more than 4 cases at any given time.
Yes.
If you're listening right now and you work in social services, I know your jaw just hit the floor. A maximum caseload of 4 families. Today, social workers are drowning under caseloads of 50 or 100. You can't possibly know 100 families.
No way, but you can know 4. And that intimate knowledge changes everything about how aid is delivered. The helpers were required to visit their assigned families every 2 weeks.
They didn't just look at a ledger.
Exactly. They knew the specific health issues of the parents. They knew exactly what the local wages were. They knew if the children were attending school or just running the streets. They knew if the father was spending the rent money at the tavern.
They became fiercely educated advocates. Because they intimately knew the reality of the household, they were empowered to bypass the red tape. If a helper walked in and saw a family freezing, they had the authority to pull cash out of their own pocket, buy coal immediately, and get reimbursed by the city later.
No waiting on a committee to approve a requisition form while a child freezes.
Right. But the disbursement of funds was always secondary. The ultimate goal of the biweekly visits was diagnosis and rehabilitation.
Yeah, the helper's primary job was to leverage their own network to find the family work, to enforce accountability, and to guide them back to self-efficiency.
The psychological impact of this is profound. When you just mail someone a check, you might accidentally breed dependency. But when you look them in the eye every 14 days, you restore their dignity while holding them accountable.
You cannot hide your destructive habits from someone who sits in your living room twice a month. But you also never feel abandoned by the system.
And the result of this hyper-relational method, a massive documented drop in municipal poverty.
It proved that material adequacy, actually giving people enough resources to survive, must be permanently welded to intense personal relationship. You cannot outsource human compassion to a centralized bureaucracy and expect human flourishing in return.
Which perfectly synthesizes the entire mission Wichern set out to accomplish back in 1848. The inner mission, as meticulously detailed in Ohl's 1911 Handbook, wasn't just about handing out Bibles to starving people, but it was equally intolerant of just handing out soup to spiritually broken people.
It was the radical, exhausting, deeply difficult commitment to treating the whole person. They recognized the inseparability of the physical body and the spiritual soul. And I think the text forces us to look in the mirror at our own modern cities. Are we addressing the root causes of our social crises? Or are we just treating the symptoms? One writer quoted in the source puts it brilliantly. If we try to save the masses without intimately addressing the individuals who make up that mass, we're essentially trying to bail out the Atlantic with a thimble.
Bailing out the Atlantic with a thimble. That is the perfect image to leave off on. We can't just keep throwing generalized impersonal policies at complex human suffering. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to look around your own community and mull over this final thought. What would happen if we applied the Elberfeld rule today?
Imagine that.
Right. Imagine if our overwhelmed, burned-out welfare systems were restructured so that social workers and community volunteers were capped at 4 cases. Imagine if instead of just processing applications, they were empowered to act as deeply invested personal advocates for just 4 families. How drastically would that relational accountability change the landscape of modern poverty? It's something to really think about the next time you hear a debate about social safety nets. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the surface, and keep learning.